She thought she could corner him on live TV, but Pete Hegseth had other plans. What happened instead left the entire studio stunned. The lights were too bright, but Pete Hegseth didn't flinch. The camera's red eye blinked open like a predator waking from sleep, and the countdown hit 0. They were live. Across from him, seated just a few feet away, was her, Madison Reese, primetime progressive, darling of Twitter, and a host known more for viral gotcha moments than actual discussion. Pete had been warned. His comms director had said, "She'll push. She wants a clip, not a conversation." But Pete wasn't here to play defense. He leaned slightly forward, posture sharp, suit pressed, eyes steady. "Tonight," Madison began with a practiced smile, "we're joined by former Army officer and current Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to talk about the state of military recruitment, systemic bias, and the future of national defense." The smile widened, too polished to be real. "Pete, welcome." "Thanks for having me," he said, his tone clipped, cordial but unflinching. The first few questions came as expected, softballs wrapped in barbed wire. She asked about recruitment numbers, veterans' mental health, and budget spending. Pete handled them like a seasoned officer reading coordinates off a map. Factual, unemotional, prepared. Then she shifted. "But Secretary Hegseth," she said, glancing at her notes and then back up, "isn't the real issue the culture within the military? A culture that, many argue, is inherently exclusive, patriarchal, even racist. Can you honestly say it's welcoming to everyone?" Pete didn't blink. The military is about unity through discipline. It doesn't cater to identity, it builds identity. That's what makes it strong. Madison smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "That's a nice slogan, but data shows disproportionate disciplinary actions, racial disparities in promotions. Isn't that systemic bias, Secretary?" Pete adjusted slightly in his chair. "There's always room for improvement, but slapping a label on the institution that has defended this nation for generations isn't analysis. It's activism." She cocked her head. "So you're saying the bias isn't real?" "I'm saying the military isn't the problem. Turning it into a social experiment is." The air between them tightened. Off camera, the crew stopped moving. One of the producers lowered her headset. They could all feel it. Something was shifting. Madison leaned in. "You say it's not a social experiment, but when trans soldiers are banned, when women report assault and get ignored, when minorities are over-disciplined, how can you defend that?" Pete inhaled through his nose. Controlled. Measured. "Because I won't let cherry-picked outrage overshadow the mission. The military isn't perfect, but it is essential, and politicizing it weakens it." Madison's smile vanished now, replaced by something harder. "You're dodging," she said. "No," Pete replied, his voice even. "I'm refusing to answer a loaded question with a yes or no. That's not how serious people talk about serious issues." The silence that followed was loud. "On the control room," a producer whispered, "she's pushing for the clip." And everyone knew it. Madison didn't flinch. She could sense the moment peaking. Her voice dropped just slightly. More intimate, more dangerous. "Let me ask you directly, Secretary Hegseth," she said, pen tapping softly against her clipboard. "Do you believe the military has a race problem?" Pete's jaw shifted once. Barely. He had been in war zones. He had testified before Congress. But this wasn't about facts. This was a trap disguised as a question, and he wasn't about to walk into it. "I believe the military has a mission," he said, voice calm, "and the more we treat it like a sociology seminar, the less capable it becomes of defending this country." Madison didn't nod. She didn't move, just stared at him. "So that's a no?" she asked. Pete looked past her directly into the lens. "That's a focus," he said, voice lower now. "On readiness, on strength, on what unites us. That's what matters." She turned her body toward the camera, like a stage actress hitting her mark. "But Secretary, a lot of Americans would argue that ignoring bias is what keeps it alive. Don't you think your views are outdated? Maybe even dangerous?" The word hung in the air. Dangerous. Pete slowly turned back to her, his face unreadable. "You know what's dangerous," he said, leaning forward now. Not aggressively, but like a teacher who'd had enough. Sending underprepared troops into combat because we were more focused on sensitivity workshops than strength training. That's dangerous. There it was, the punchline. Delivered not as an attack, but a correction. Madison blinked. She had wanted a reaction. She got a rebuke. From the corner of the room, a cameraman shifted slightly. The air had gone dense again. Electric. "So let me ask you this," she said, tone rising just a fraction. "Why are you so resistant to change? Isn't that what leadership demands?" Pete didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded his hands. Calm, controlled. "Change isn't always progress," he said, "and leadership isn't pandering. It's making decisions that won't trend on Twitter, but will keep Americans safe." This time, the silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. Madison leaned back slightly, not in retreat, more like a recalculation. She glanced toward the control room, where her producer gave the slightest nod. And just like that, she pivoted again. "Well, if we're talking about keeping Americans safe," she said, voice softening into faux sincerity, "let's discuss the recent whistleblower reports on mishandled abuse cases. You've remained notably silent on those. Why?" Pete's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "I haven't been silent," he said. "I've spoken directly with military leadership, not performatively on cable news." "You think holding people accountable is performative?" "I think pretending to hold people accountable while chasing ratings is." There it was again. Controlled fire. A jab that didn't scream. It smoldered. Madison opened her mouth, paused, then smiled again. She had just been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. But she wasn't done. Madison's expression shifted, just enough for those watching closely to notice. The charm cracked at the edges. The tone sharpened. "So now the media's the enemy?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief, as if he'd just confirmed every suspicion. Pete didn't take the bait. He didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was almost quiet. "Number. But when journalism becomes provocation, when the goal is attention instead of truth, then it's no longer journalism." Across the studio, a producer inhaled sharply. He'd said it, not aggressively, not in anger, but with a certainty that didn't need volume to land hard. Madison straightened her papers unnecessarily. It was a stalling gesture, a cue to the viewers that the next part would be the turning point. "So let's clarify," she said, locking eyes with him. "You're saying that the stories from minority service members, those who say they've faced discrimination, assault, neglect, you're saying those are exaggerated? That they're lying?" The framing was precise. Weaponized empathy. Pete's face didn't move. "I'm saying we don't build policy off anecdotes," he replied. "We build it off facts, off mission readiness, off results. I've met soldiers of every race, gender, background. You know what unites them? The mission, not the politics." "And what about the ones who feel unseen?" she pressed. "They signed up to serve a cause bigger than themselves," he said, his voice low but steady. "That's the point. Service isn't about being seen, it's about showing up and doing your job." The words weren't flashy. They were dangerous because they were real. In that moment, something shifted in the room. Not just the energy, but the sense of control. Madison had walked into this interview assuming she'd be in charge of the story. Now she was reacting to it. She sat back a little too quickly and crossed her arms. "Well, Secretary," she said, a bite in her tone now, "I think a lot of Americans would disagree." Pete tilted his head slightly. Not smug, not dismissive, just certain. "That's the beauty of America," he said. "You're free to disagree, but disagreement doesn't make you right." The pause was deafening. In living rooms across the country, people leaned in closer to their screens. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a mirror, showing us the cost of what we've turned public discourse into. Then Madison went for the final shot. "Well, I guess we'll let the audience decide what kind of leadership they want," she said. "One that evolves, or one that clings to the past." Pete stood, not in protest, just because the segment was clearly over. But before taking off the mic, he said one last thing. "Leadership that follows the mob isn't leadership, it's marketing." And just like that, the feed cut to commercial. The studio lights dimmed, but the tension didn't. Pete stepped off the set, the earpiece still buzzing faintly in his ear, his comms aide already waiting with a phone in hand. "It's everywhere," she whispered. "Twitter, TikTok, headlines are dropping already." Pete didn't need to look. He could feel it. He'd been in enough firefights to know when something had detonated. A junior producer brushed past, eyes wide, whispering into her headset, "We have a situation." Behind them, in the control room, the segment was being replayed in real time. Editors already clipping the most provocative exchanges. On the monitor, his words looped back. "Leadership that follows the mob isn't leadership. It's marketing." It sounded even sharper the second time. His aide was scrolling furiously. "Trending now. Hegseth meltdown. Military denial. And, wait, silencing truth." She looked up. "They're running with the narrative." Pete exhaled, slow and steady. "Of course they are." By the time he reached the lobby, journalists had begun to gather outside. Cameras were already mounted, microphones extended like spears. His phone buzzed again. Group chat. "Fox News panel wants you on tonight. CNN requesting statement." Hegseth, a fascist, is gaining steam. Pete looked out the glass doors to the mob of reporters. He could walk into that chaos. Fight the spin. Explain. Clarify. Or, he turned to his aide. "Where's the full footage?" She nodded. "We've got the raw feed, start to finish." "Good," Pete said. "We release it. Nothing cut, no edits. Just post it." Her eyes flicked up. "Right now?" "Right now." He paused. "And caption it, 'Watch for yourself.' That's it. No hashtags, no commentary." Moments later, the video went live. Within minutes, thousands were watching. But even as views ticked upward, the war had already begun. On screen, Madison Reese was already seated in a second studio, this one moodier, lit with that perfect balance of righteous indignation and soft shadows. "I asked real questions," she said, staring straight into the camera. "And I was dismissed, talked down to, and silenced. That should concern every American who believes in transparency." The host nodded solemnly as if the words carried the weight of the Constitution itself. Pete watched from a small back office, arms folded, the full clip playing beside the new headline. "Secretary Hegseth implodes under pressure from brave journalist." He didn't laugh. He didn't fume. He just waited. Then finally someone spoke up. It came from a conservative broadcast, a middle-aged host with graying temples and the tired voice of someone who'd seen too many political cycles. He cut to Pete's full footage and let it roll, stopping only to add, "This isn't journalism. This is bait." She wanted a viral moment. She got one. Another panelist nodded. She pushed, interrupted, reframed. "That's not seeking truth. That's seeking traction." And then came the kicker. She underestimated him. Pete sat alone in the room, the glow of the TV flickering against the wall behind him. Outside, the media circus was reaching full pitch, shouting into microphones, waving phones, snapping pictures through tinted glass. Inside, everything was still. He reached for his coffee. It had gone cold. His aide re-entered, her expression unreadable, holding up a phone. "It's spreading. The full clip." She nodded. "It's catching fire on Reddit, YouTube, even LinkedIn. People are breaking it down frame by frame." Pete raised an eyebrow. "They're noticing what you didn't say, how you didn't flinch, how you didn't attack her personally. You stayed on mission." He gave a quiet chuckle. Didn't know that counted for something these days. Apparently it still does. She hesitated. But Madison just went live again, this time crying. Said she was humiliated, that it was a form of institutional silencing. And it's working. Celebrities are reposting it. Pete didn't respond, just turned back toward the window. This wasn't about him. It wasn't even about Madison. It was about how truth had become theater and how easily the audience forgot it was a show. He spoke softly. "Let them spin it. The full footage is out there. If people care about truth, they'll see it." "But what if they don't?" she asked. He paused, then looked her dead in the eye. "Then they don't, but I'm not trading integrity for applause." The door creaked open. A second aide entered, visibly tense. We just got word. White House won't comment directly, but an internal memo leaked. They're distancing. No condemnation, but no defense either. Pete didn't blink. Of course they are, he muttered. And the Hill, he asked. The aide hesitated. Some GOP senators are backing you hard. They see it as a win. Calm under fire. Truth over tantrum. That sort of thing. Pete nodded slowly. And the networks? The first aide sighed. Split right down the middle. Left says you bulldozed a female journalist. Right says you stayed cool and exposed the performance. Pete's voice was barely above a whisper. Then the mission's complete. The aide stared. You don't want to go on air? Clarify? Make a public statement? He shook his head. The more I explain, the less they listen. They've already chosen sides. I'm not here to argue with the audience. I'm here to serve the country. A moment passed in silence. Then Pete leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. This isn't just about me. It's about where we're headed. If performance replaces policy, if spectacle drowns substance, then what are we even defending? They didn't answer. They didn't have to. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door. Behind him, the aides watched as he stepped into the hallway, the noise of the outside world growing louder, sharper, more chaotic with every step. But Pete didn't hesitate, because sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting back, it's standing still while the storm spins around you. By nightfall, the internet was ablaze. Clips of the interview flooded every platform, each with its own spin, its own cropped version of the truth. On one feed, Pete was trending as a dangerous relic. On another, he was a calm warrior in a world of chaos. Cable news split like a fault line. One side aired a slow-motion shot of Madison blinking back tears with the headline, "Silenced for Speaking Truth." Another played Pete's full response uninterrupted, framed by a chyron that read, "Hegseth holds the line." But it was a podcast, one without cameras or clickbait, that cut through the noise. A veteran journalist, long retired, spoke into a microphone with gravel in his voice and decades in his tone. I watched the whole thing, he said, and here's what I saw. A reporter fishing for outrage and a leader who didn't take the bait. He paused, then added, you don't have to agree with Pete Hegseth. That's not the point. The point is, he answered the question. She just didn't like the answer. The clip went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. By the next morning, op-eds clashed in the usual places. This is what authoritarianism looks like in a suit. America needs more Pete Hegseths and fewer actors playing journalists. Was she silenced or just not spotlighted? Meanwhile, Madison released a carefully produced video, muted piano music, a softly lit room. She spoke of pain and professional trauma. She never once mentioned the multiple interruptions, or the framing, or the plan. Pete watched in silence, alone in his office. He didn't scowl. He didn't sigh. He just reached for a notebook and jotted one sentence. They'll sell the show, but we'll keep building the wall. A knock on the door. His aide entered again, holding up a tablet. You need to see this. It was a headline. Simple, clean, no spin. Watch the full interview. And below it, the view count. 14 million and rising. Comments are split, she said. But a lot of people are saying the same thing. I came here expecting outrage. I stayed for the clarity. Pete nodded. Then finally, after a long silence, he smiled. Just slightly. Because in a world desperate for chaos, sometimes the boldest act of leadership is to stay still, speak plainly, and let the truth echo longer than the noise. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the world spinning beneath him. And he whispered, not for cameras, not for headlines, not for applause, just for himself. Let them talk. We've got work to do.